right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our final session of day one of our SciPEP conference about relevance, connection, utility, about basic science. I'm really excited about this session. I have been really impressed with how often this topic has come up in the past couple years, but especially even today. And so I'm really looking forward to our great panel to discuss this idea about what do we even mean by relevance and connection to basic science. I think the last two panels really touched on this in a number of profound ways to set the stage for this conversation. We heard from Chris Volpe and his Science Counts data, this idea of publics being payoff minded and scientists, especially those who identify more on the basic side of the spectrum, as more process minded. And one of the things that I've seen and that we've talked about then is distilling that down to how can we think about being less process minded in our communication and more payoff minded so that we're connecting to what audiences want. But with that kind of journey, one of the other things that I've seen happen in that conversation is that means we need to make our science about some eventual utility, whether it's basic science as it serves in understanding vaccines, the COVID pandemic, basic science as something that we can use the building blocks for as we're coming up to more energy solutions in the face of climate change. It's typically around an instrumental framework and a utility framework. And so this is something that in the past couple of years as SciPEP has been exploring these topics. Really came to a head about a month ago when there was a group of us having a conversation about this and wrestling with this payoff versus process. And with us that day in those conversations was Mónica Feliú-Mójer, who can't be with us today, but she shared her thoughts on video before coming here. And she really challenged this paradigm that if we have scientists try to make their science relevant to people, why do we typically with basic scientists then reduce this to a utility and a utilitarian framework? And might we think more broadly about what relevance and connection is for basic science? So this session is going to explore that. We're going to hear a pre-recorded talk, about 10 minutes from Mónica, and then I'll invite my panelists that are here with me to come up on screen to have a discussion about it. So it'll just be one talk and then a lot of discussion about it. So please put your thoughts in the chat as you're hearing Mónica's video, and then I'll invite my panelists up and we'll chat about it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mónica Feliú-Mójer. I work with the nonprofits Ciencia, Puerto Rico and Science Communication Lab. I want to thank the Kavli Foundation and the Department of Energy for once again having me at the SciPEP conference. I'm sorry that I can't be with you live today, but I'm grateful that I can share these recorded remarks to get us started in the conversation about what relevance means to basic science. I often start my talks with this image. This is a fly brain where neurons have been fluorescently labeled so that we can see where they go and how they connect to each other. This image makes science relevant to me for several reasons. One, because I'm a neurobiologist by training. Two, because let's be honest, it's really beautiful. And then three, because it's a great metaphor about the importance of connection. Neurons are really cool cells on their own, but their true power comes from connections to other neurons. Now, I want to invite you to think about what makes you feel connected to science. What makes science relevant to you? Some of the answers I've received before include curiosity, learning new things, asking and answering questions, observation, the process of science, community, helping people, beauty, awe, wonder. Maybe some of these answers mirror your own. I want to tell you about a few other things that make me feel connected to science, that make science relevant to me. The beach, lizards, cows. Beyond nature, the one thing that connects all of these is Puerto Rico, where these images were captured and where I was born and raised. My love and my interest for science, what makes science relevant to me, is intimately connected with my identities and my culture as a Puerto Rican woman from a rural working class community. So what does it mean to make basic science relevant? Well, it means connecting science to people's everyday lives, who they are, and what they care about. In other words, connecting science to their culture and context. When I say culture, I mean languages, customs, beliefs, knowledge, and identities of an individual or a group of people. Culture is broadly encompassing. Also, everyone has culture. However, there are dominant cultures, and we often fail to consider or remember this. In science and in science communication, the dominant culture is white, Western, and of the global North, meaning the US, Canada, Europe, and Australia. Connecting science to people's context and culture helps them make sense of science. And I think most importantly for basic science, making it relevant means going beyond utility. Because basic science's main goal is to advance knowledge, we commonly try to make it relevant by telling people how, for example, understanding protein X might eventually save their lives or cure a disease, or that studying subatomic particle collisions maybe will, I don't know, make energy production more efficient. But I'd argue that this relevance equals utility framework is limiting and can be counterproductive to basic science because relevance is not always equivalent to utility. Relevance is a lot more. I'd argue that instead, we should think about relevance as connection. Going back to my previous brain analogy, a neuron's true power comes from its connections to other neurons. Similarly, when communication and engagement with basic science are centered on connection, it can be much more powerful and effective. So how might we make basic science relevant? From my own work, I'd say by making science culturally relevant, meaning connecting it to the culture and the context of an audience, leveraging the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, and identities of an audience to make science more pertinent and valuable for them. Now, there are multiple strategies for this, and I'll share some examples in the next few slides. Of course, utility is not always bad, and we can make science relevant by making it practical, like Ciencia Puerto Rico did when we worked with participants of Boys and Girls Club Puerto Rico to teach them how to use engineering to keep them and their families healthier by building a hand washing station that used no energy, little water, and little soap after Hurricane Maria in 2017, when hand washing became very difficult due to the lack of basic services. We can make basic science relevant by finding common ground with our audience, tapping into our identities, where we live, or our hobbies. That's what scientist and evangelical Christian Dr. Catherine Hayhoe does to discuss topics of climate change with conservative and religious audiences who in the US are often skeptical about climate change as well. We can connect basic science with our audiences by communicating it in a person's first language to make it more accessible and understandable and thus more relevant. That's what Corey Gray, who was part of the team of researchers at LIGO, who detected gravitational waves for the first time, did when he collaborated with his mother, Sharon Yellowfly, to translate the press releases of this historical observation into the endangered language of the Siksika or Blackfoot people. Corey and Sharon's actions not only made science relevant to their community, but also showcased the importance of Indigenous languages and Indigenous people in science. We can make science relevant by connecting it to our audience's previous knowledge, life experiences, values with analogies, metaphors, music, or pop culture references. That's what we did in this video I'm about to show you. From the latest public service campaign included in Aquí Nos Cuidamos, which translates, here we take care of each other, a multimedia education and community engagement project promoting prevention and well-being in Puerto Rico. We used culturally relevant music, visuals, and language, both Spanish and sign language, to promote the adoption of preventive behaviors among Puerto Rican audiences.
Aún en tiempos de crisis y de retos, hay herramientas de prevención a tu alcance. Usar mascarilla en escenarios de alto riesgo, mantener tu vacunación al día yendo por tus boosters, practicar el autocuidado a diario con rutinas de actividad física, social y de recreación, y promover un entorno saludable haciendo buen manejo del agua, removiendo escombros y practicando la higiene, son algunas acciones cotidianas que ayudan a prevenir enfermedades y a manejar diagnósticos de salud. La prevención es la clave. Aún en tiempos de...
Finally, we can make basic science relevant by practicing reflexivity. Reflexivity refers to the examination of identities, biases, and privileges, and taking actions based on that examination, for example, to redress inequities. When I started working with the deaf community in Puerto Rico through the project Aquí Nos Cuidamos, which I just mentioned, I learned that due to systemic educational barriers and discrimination, some deaf people lack the proficiency necessary to read captions. Now, as a hearing person, I used to think that adding subtitles to videos was enough. But I learned that the best way to make content accessible for people who are deaf is with sign language interpreters. Reflexivity allowed me to realize how my biases and my privileges had prevented me from understanding this before. Based on this reflexivity, I took actions such as hiring sign language interpreters and changing me and my team's production workflow to ensure that the content of Aquí Nos Cuidamos is accessible, inclusive, and relevant to deaf people. Another critical question we must ask is who decides what's relevant when it comes to basic science? Of course, there are multiple actors, multiple people that participate in this decision and this conversation, but I'd like to remind us that as communicators and engagers, we must center our audience, and that's precisely why we need engagement, to build relationships, have dialogues, and mutual learning. So is relevance the frame we need to use when it comes to basic science? I say yes. I think it's critical that we remember that relevance is about connecting with audiences in ways that are meaningful and pertinent to their culture and their context, not just about utility. Thinking about relevance as connection can help us engage diverse audiences across differences in different contexts and be more effective. Finally, I think more research is needed into relevance. For example, how relevance relates to culture and context, values, political ideologies. I also think that we need more trainings for people to communicate basic science using this framework of relevance. And of course, there need to be more opportunities for folks to practice and hone those communication and engagement skills. And I know that is very much part of what we will continue to discuss in the remainder of this meeting and beyond. So I want to thank you so much again for having me, for the invitation, for your attention. And I look forward to continuing to chat about these topics.
Okay, welcome Tiffany, Jeannie, and Fanuel to have this conversation with you. I'd like to just take a few minutes to say hi to you and have you each introduce yourself. So we could go around and hear who you are, where you're from, and a little bit about your own background, about what brings you to this conversation today. Would love to hear that. Fanuel, let's get started with you.
All right. Again, wonderful to be here. My name is Fanuel Muindi. I'm the Lasker Fellow for Civic Science at Research America. In addition, I run a nonprofit incubator, civic science incubator in Boston called the Sci Resident Collective. I describe myself as a civic science scholar and entrepreneur. I'm a former neuroscientist turned civic science scholar and entrepreneur. And I think a lot about how do we support those who are trying to start initiatives in this space. And for this conversation, my work as a Lasker Fellow, I've been essentially trying to map the genome of civic science training initiatives in in this space. So throughout the whole conversation this morning and this afternoon, thinking a lot about what kind of trainings people have been mentioning are needed or currently in place right now. So trying to map that has been quite fulfilling and interesting. So I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation. And I'm a former marathoner and a Trekkie.
All right. Thank you. Tiffany.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tiffany Lowwater. I'm Assistant Dean for Communications at UC Berkeley's College of Computing, Data Science, and Society. So I had recently, I'd say recently 2 years ago, I left a role at the American Association for the Advancement of Science to come work at the university level, a great university, I would say, UC Berkeley. Really great science across many different spectrums, so all the way from very basic science to very applied. And I'm really enjoying this role, partly because it's about connecting science to people's lives and thinking about what's happening in the applied section, AI, but what goes behind developing these types of technologies. So a lot of it's basic science that is now becoming very highlighted in popular press. And so how do we help scientists, faculty, students, administrators think about what are the connections between these places and what people might need to know about them in order to make decisions, in order to decide whether this is a career that they want to explore. Lots of different things going on there. So I'm here because I really love the idea about making theories and discoveries in computer science and data science relevant to people. And I think that happens through a variety of things, which I know we're going to get into in a little bit, but I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Tiffany. Jeannie, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Brooke, and thank you everyone for your attendance and attention. My name is Jeannie Garbino. I'm currently the Executive Director of RockEDU Science Outreach, which is the centralized engagement hub for the Rockefeller University, which is a basic science institution in New York City. And so I am here because my job is basically to bridge basic science, information, process, how to think about mentorship with people who are currently non-scientists. And so I work with scientists in mentorship capacities. I work with high school students, undergraduates, and other members of the public to essentially learn about the process of science, to think about exploration, to embrace failure and things like that. And just because of Fanuel, I don't know what the equivalent for a Tolkien fan is for Trekkie, but I think I'm a Tolkienite, maybe. I don't know. So
I love it.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, thanks to all three of you. Excited to dive in. So I was struck in Monica's talk about how she really pushed back on this paradigm or framework of feeling like we're constantly, when we think about relevance, trying to say some future application, and talked a little bit about how relevance can be many different kinds of things. I'm curious, in your experiences, each of you, I'd love for you all to share your thoughts on this. You have rich experiences in different parts of science and the science communication ecosystem. Have you also observed a tendency to think about utility when talking about basic science? And if so, why do you think that happens? And if not, what do you see as the more common paradigm in thinking about what relevance is and how to define it? Tiffany, could you get us started?
Sure. I mean, I think that this is very common, as someone who used to help advocate for science for a large scientific organization. I think many individuals and institutions, so I think it's at the scientific level, like at the individual scientist level and communicator level, as well as at institutions, they feel the need for funding. And a lot of times in basic science, one of the ways that is conveyed is through eventual potential. We explore lots of things, but we hope that they will have an intended impact in the future. And so I think that is often kind of the motivation behind it. It's not necessarily an audience motivation, except in this fact that trying to increase public awareness of scientific research in order to continue public funding of scientific research. But I think that there's generally, coming from the institutional perspective, we want to make sure we can keep doing this thing. Therefore, I don't think that's always the most effective way, but I do think it is very common.
Thank you.
I can add to that a little bit, because I think in addition, I think it's the way that we're trained as scientists. So I forgot to mention my training, my professional training is in basic science. I'm a lipid biochemist. But I think every time I had to write a grant, every time I had to write a paper, and especially if my PIs were like, we're gonna go for nature or something like that, you always had to connect it. I mean, biomedical research, so we always had to connect it to a disease or some sort of human process, even though my models have always been, yeast, cells, and mice. So I had to somehow link, my yeast cells to diabetes, right? And so I think it's just sort of the default, and I'm not sure that many scientists know to think about other ways beyond utility, just because it's just the way we're trained in everything we do in the professional communications of science.
Yeah, and seconding that, the default mode that Jeannie just mentioned, that's exactly right. My own training as well, neuroscience, putting that hat on. I really like what John Beasley talked about earlier, right? That we have to really think about our goals, right? Both from the scientist point of view, but also on the audience. And so to answer your question, Brooke, more directly, maybe there are issues where we skip some of these steps, right? You're not thinking about the audience in mind, and so you default to your kind of standard mode, right? So that ends up creating this utilitarian view that could be there. But perhaps we have to think about, well, where then can we help basic scientists get better at defining their goals and defining the goals of their audiences, right? And someone posed this question earlier, which audience do they have access to right now, right? And what are they learning and where do they need access to? So then we can zoom out and see and ask ourselves, what is the milieu of support that they need, right? To make these connections, as Mónica mentioned, it really is about connection. How can we help them make better connections? And
that's a great point. That is it. If we were successful in thinking through goals and audiences more specifically, intentionally, and strategically, maybe we wouldn't find ourselves in this utility trap. The utilitarian trap might be very similar to the deficit model trap, where we don't know what we're doing. We're just going to do what seems like the right thing to do, which is say why this related to my iPhone or this vaccine. So that's a great point you make. One of the other things that Mónica talked about, which I thought was really powerful, is also pushing any scientist that's communicating, and especially as we're thinking about basic people who apply more with doing basic science in being more relevant, is also pushing yourself out of a dominant cultural paradigm or your cultural paradigm. And I'd also love to hear from the three of you about your experience with this, and also thinking through, as we're working to communicate science and doing this, what does that take? And is there more we can be doing as a community of communication experts, scholars, and people trying to engage with folks to think about how to appreciate other cultural views, push out of a dominant cultural paradigm, and bring that into how we think about how our science might be relevant?
So I think there could be potentially from my perspective, two points to answer this question. The first is, because there is a dominant culture that's so pervasive in science, many people are extremely comfortable communicating in the style of that dominant culture, scientists in particular. Scientists, so one of the first things that I try to work to do when we do some comms training here is to encourage scientists to be a little bit uncomfortable, to go outside what they normally do, go outside their normal boundaries, to think about different ways that science can be communicated, and different ways that we can connect over science. And I think the second point is around, valuing knowledge in ways that are different from the dominant culture, or a little bit. So just thinking about knowledge, who holds knowledge, which knowledge is valid, how do we think about and respond to the types of knowledge that feel like they're outside the dominant culture realm of acceptance of what can be rigorous knowledge or a foundational knowledge.
Thanks, Jeannie. Fanuel, you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and Jeannie mentioned this, right, dominant cultures there. The one thing that kept coming back to me, thinking about training, and I don't know if you can train these things, right? Earlier, a speaker was mentioned the willingness. That's the key word here for my insight here. The willingness to be vulnerable, willingness to listen, to say, tell me more, to play, to co-create, to share, to learn, right? How do you then instill that in training, right? Just normal scientific training, so that when you do come to talk about engaging, it's already built in, so that that question about who then is your audience, it comes naturally, and then you can think more strategically about then what am I doing? What are my goals? What are the goals of my audience, right? So that willingness, and if I put on my sort of training programs, there are diverse training programs that tackle multiple aspects of this in very different ways, using various terminologies, right? And so it's interesting. Mónica mentioned using relevance, right, as a training mindset, if you will, right, in programs. How that translates to actual, training, I don't know. I'm not sure, but I'm willing to bet that people are doing this work very, very well, and just doing it in very different ways. So,
I wanted to also mention that I think that connecting scientists to the cultural interest is important. So if you have a scientist as a messenger, are you going out to identify scientists who maybe would connect with an audience for various reasons, either it's cultural identity or other things? And I think thinking about who's the right messenger for different kinds of, different kinds of platforms. So I know Mónica had mentioned in her video, her talk about Catherine Hayhoe, and she identifies as evangelical Christian. A few years ago, she told a story at a AAAS meeting about an atheist scientist coming to her and saying, I'd really like to go to churches and talk to people about climate change. And she said, I appreciate that. And also, I think there may be other platforms that are more relevant. So I think, thinking about, are we doing a service, or are we potentially doing a disservice to the communication by who we choose? And I think within the scientific community, as Jeannie mentioned before, many scientists are trained in a very specific way how to communicate about their science, and in English and other places. But if we're really centering our audience, we need to think about what do they need from the communication, not necessarily what the scientists feel like they should be providing.
Yeah, there's a question. Oh, sorry, Fanuel, go ahead.
Just to add that, when Mónica also shared this insight that when she did that for her own project, right, it opened up and made her realize something that she had been assuming, right? I think these assumptions, or how do we create opportunities to test our assumptions so that those kind of questions can take place.
Which was also something that came up earlier today, in terms of too often our goals and objectives are about other groups changing instead of ourselves changing. And so bringing that thought back in. There was a question in the Q&A stream here that's relevant to this, so I want to pull it into the conversation right now. So this came from Shay, thinking about how often messengers within a community are most trusted and effective. How can we as science communicators connect with ambassadors in non-dominant cultures so that we can connect and partner more effectively? Anyone have thoughts about that? Jeannie, I know you do a lot of this in your work. I don't know if you want to get us started.
Sure. So I know that in New York City, we have a very rich STEM education community. And so there's already people who are embedded in communities. And I don't think that, one of the things that I often have to do is talk scientists who want to do some sort of engagement. People are really drawn to doing engagement in communities that are quote unquote underserved, right? And they want to go into these classrooms and they're like, I'm going to show them science and they're going to love science, right? And you're like, okay, yes, and. So I think it's really important to find the people that are already embedded, who are trusted ambassadors to certain communities that you want to reach. Talk with them, ask them how you can, you have to find who they are. And then you ask them, what does your community need? How do you think that we should engage that community, what kinds of topics are relevant, who or what kind of person would be best suited for this type of thing. So, you know, in New York City, if we need to have like Mandarin speaking scientists or Spanish speaking scientists, you know, we find that. I also work with the Orthodox Jewish community around genetics, and it's very strict on what kinds of things you can talk about and what kinds of things are taboo to talk about. And so, you know, it's really important to listen to those community leaders to understand the boundaries and what is a go, and what kinds of activities or approaches or strategies would potentially resonate before you just go in and do the thing that you think that you want to do.
And piggybacking off that, as you can see from what Jeannie said, it's not something you wake up one morning and suddenly you can do tomorrow, right? It takes time. It takes commitment. It takes that investment, right? And willingness, back to that keyword again, willingness, that this is what I want to do. And so that you can engage and talk to the audiences and so forth. And I think this is where if you skip this step, you run into this utilitarian view very quickly, or you go back to your default mode very, very quickly. Yeah. Right. So it's that skipping this step.
Fanuel, I will say it's taking me, you know, I've networked in New York City. It's taken me like 10 years to really build a strong base. So I do want to really emphasize your point that this takes time. I spend a huge amount of time schmoozing. I sometimes call myself a professional science schmoozer.
But you don't have to, right? And this is my earlier point, that the milieu of support, right? It already exists, and it's about creating that scaffold and helping basic scientists know that it exists. Where is it, and how can they tap into it to make them, to do what they can do?
I want to bring forward this question from Sarah, which Sarah, if you'll allow me or forgive me, I'm going to take your question and then also build on it a little bit, because it's a great foundation to a few other points. So Sarah says, this has me thinking when we talk about relevance, is anyone tapping into the definition of science as a process versus as a set of known facts to make science more relevant? For example, can we use the innate curiosity of scientists to make science relevant rather than or along with a focus on the actual topic? So this is a really, really good question. Yeah, I'm just going to add a little bit to it, Tiffany, because there's so much richness here. We'll talk about this for a few minutes. I mean, obviously, this is something that's been talked about today, too, is curiosity the process, but not the payout? And this is a conversation I've had with a number of folks. And when Mónica was here talking about this with us a couple months ago, she said this too, like, can't curiosity be a payout? That's why I do it. That is my payout. Curiosity is the payout. It's not a product. And so like where does process end and payout begin? And just also want to channel, I know we had John in a previous session and we've got Anthony Dudo tomorrow. As we've talked with them about this, they really push on, but why do you want people to be curious? That's, we need to get to the why. It's not, curiosity might not be enough, but is it enough? And so it just like gets everything to a head, I think, around a lot of these questions about basic science and supporting basic scientists who are so excited about sharing their curiosity. A lot of them are motivated to do their work because they're curious about something. Can curiosity be a payout? Is that not enough? And under what circumstances do we need to think about something more specific as an outcome or payout? Tiffany, get us started.
I'm thinking of relevant examples. So like, I think one thing is that if you can talk about your work, so two things. One is in training, oftentimes I'd had scientists come to me and say, I know that you want me to have messages that are like for what are people going to be able to do with this? But my research, I'm a basic mathematician, or I don't have anything like that. So what can I do? And I always default to process and like, why do you do what you do? How do you involve yourself? Why is this something that appeals to you? People may not attach themselves to, well, I want to be a mathematician too, or like, wow, that's cool. But it could be like, because you have so much excitement about what you're learning, like to convey that excitement is helpful, because then people can connect even just to that excitement, even if they don't care about the end result. So I think there's something about conveying your passion for what you're doing that I think is really valuable. And I'm thinking of another example where I heard someone give a talk where they were actually going into the neurological things that were happening inside of a developing child, but they showed a photo on the screen of their own children and said, this is what I'm studying. And also I am, you know, conveying the fact like I am a father. And so they were trying to make a connection to, do you ever wonder about what's going on? I'm going to tell you some of that. So I think that's part of the, you know, being able to do both the awe and inspiration and curiosity and connect it to something that that audience may have relevance to. I think that's where it can be helpful.
And to keep doing that, right? Because that why, if you understand your why, in this case, it helps you sustain that engagement. It's not a once and done approach, right? I'll do this my one outreach and I'm finished. It's how can I keep this thing going? I think understanding that why helps a lot.
And I think listening to when you have audience conversations about it, like what works and what doesn't work, so that the next time I go to a similar audience, I can improve on that.
I also think one of the most powerful phrases in science communication is "I don't know." I think, you know, and it's like we have to still explore that. We still don't, you know, I think wonder, curiosity, I think they are emotions of science, I suppose. And I think so I don't necessarily have to find a common interest with someone to connect with them. I think I can connect with, or people, you know, who are good communicators can often connect with people through emotionality. It doesn't always have to, I can not know someone, we can have completely different interests. And I don't need to have a pop culture reference or something like that to bring us together. Sometimes, you know, we see something silly and we're just like, wow, did you see that? Or, you know, there's some sort of emotional connection that you can make that's independent of any kind of relevance, I suppose, you know. And I'll just also add on, like, there's a ton of things that are relevant to my life, and no disrespect to physicists out there, but like, for example, satellites and how satellites are relevant to our lives. Everybody uses an iPhone or an Android phone or something like that. I don't want to know anything about how satellites work, and it's just so uninteresting to me, right? So I think, you know, just because something might be a part of someone's life, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have interest in it enough to connect with you on that science.
That's a great point. I want to bring forward a question that Anna Middleton asked here, as it's relevant to this conversation here. She acknowledges that if we shift to think about perspectives of the public instead of scientists' motivations, then this means that perhaps scientists need to be prepared to feel vulnerable. And how do you prepare scientists for feeling okay about their vulnerability? I'm just going to add to this to remind everyone that the focus of our conversations today and tomorrow is also thinking about, is that different for basic scientists? And this is a topic that's come up before that I've heard from a number of folks anecdotally, that this may be, I don't think we have evidence about this, but maybe even harder for people who identify on the physics, math, basic science end of things to feel vulnerable about their way of knowing and what they know. So I'm curious, how can you support scientists to encourage them to be more vulnerable, and any perspectives on if it's different or unique for basic scientists specifically?
So if I can just quickly jump in, you know, that question about the basic scientists, do you need something separate for them? I don't know the answer to that myself. But, you know, there are organizations out there that are trying to essentially create these conditions, right, where one you can learn and leverage our sort of shared experiences. And one that comes to mind, and Jeannie, you may know them, the Cultivating Ensembles conference in New York. So to the question that was asked, I think they have created this space, right, where you can practice almost feeling vulnerable, right? So that you can take that and then go in your own practice and practice essentially, right? And customer is just one of those initiatives that are out there. And this is about how do we then support them to duplicate these efforts elsewhere, experiment in their local communities, and seeing what works. Because this idea of creating this support infrastructure, right? The tactics may be different for basic scientists. I acknowledge that the tactics may be different. The goal is still the same, but the tactics.
Yeah.
And I think that separation is important to think about.
Thank you. Other thoughts on this point?
I also think incorporating, yes, for customer, very fun. But I also think about incorporating more trainings in terms of well, trainings is the wrong word. It's sort of more setting the tone for agreeing upon a set of norms, right? So as an example, one of the norms that we hold at RockEDU is be willing to be uncomfortable. And we try to say, when someone comes to me and says like, something's blah, 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 and I'm like, this is a great example where you can be willing to be uncomfortable. Is that something that we want to do together, right? And I think just sort of pointing out when people have that moment of like, I don't know if this is working, or, you know, you emphasize that it's okay to be uncomfortable, and being willing to sit in that discomfort is actually like one of the best learning events that you might be able to have when it comes to science communication, or just, I mean, it's also an awesome parenting hack. I'll just say that. I say that to my teenage daughters all the time. And I also want to say that I think exercises like improv is super uncomfortable. So I think it helps to like build that resilience for like being vulnerable.
Tiffany, you want to add anything?
I would just add that I think practice is really important. I think once a scientist does convey something about themselves that maybe, like, so the example before about talking about his children, I know a lot of scientists who would never put a photo of their children on the screen. Like, that would just not be something they'd be comfortable with. But I think that you can, when you do something like that and you see the response of the audience and you get some kind of feedback that was actually helpful in terms of making a connection, then that encourages you to maybe think about ways to do that more. And I also definitely think, I mean, I know there's been this debate about, you know, can all scientists do all the things? I saw somebody say, like, depending on audience, I really don't think they can. I really feel like we should be putting people into places where they have an interest in some capability. And, you know, maybe we can increase their interest and capability. That's a whole nother conversation. But I think forcing this on people who are just not well equipped and very uncomfortable to the point where they fail. Uncomfortable is good, but like uncomfortable and failing is not good in terms of encouraging them to continue. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. I love this very simple question. Is utility really all that bad?
I don't think so. Going back to what John Beasley was talking about, the audience is quite diverse and they have diverse goals. Some do want the utility, point blank, right? And that's okay. But the fundamental thing is understanding what the goals are.
Yeah. I recently had a conversation with someone who challenges too around, is relevance and utility the frame you use to talk about and engage with people about your basic science, or do we have this weird assumption that in the back of our minds we're trying to make utility our goal? Like, we have to have everyone understand why this is important, why this is useful, and that we've got then these conflicting approaches within our strategies of like, it's a frame, but is it also our goal? And are we being honest with ourselves that it's maybe not the goal we're saying out loud, but it's really what we're trying to do is to make the case for why basic science especially is important. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about that. Relevance, parentheses, sometimes utility as a frame versus as the goal for communication. Tiffany, you've probably seen this in your experience.
Yeah, I think it could be either. I mean, I would say that it can be either. And, you know, it depends on what the, you know, all this gets down to like, what is it that you're trying to accomplish and how are you going to measure it? So, you know, you can employ relevance and values in the development of messages and frame them in ways that are most relevant to the audience. Like, that's one way that you could use it. But the goal would be to inform or inspire. Like, then a specific goal could be like, let's say you have gardeners as an audience. I'm just going to pick one. You could inform or inspire an audience using messages that are like, these are the insects that interact with your prized tomatoes. This is what I study, right? And that would be a goal that you're connecting it to, you're using relevance as a way to accomplish your goal.
Again, a tactic, right?
Yeah.
I think people get confused there, tactics, strategy, so.
Yeah.
Well, you know, yes, Anne, and I think there's a goal in basic science, there's always an assumption that eventually there will be utility. And I wonder if it's also an issue of time scale. You know, one of the biggest examples that I offer to my students is the story of green fluorescent protein, or GFP. This was a protein that was isolated from a jellyfish, and nobody knew what to do with it, and nobody wanted to fund that research or anything. And as it turns out, it's like the most utilized tool in molecular biology, and it's uncovered so many other things. And so I think it's also time scale.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have a lot of stories where there was something that was just explored and it turned, like CRISPR is another example, and then it turned into this huge application, but we don't always know. And I actually think having that conversation, like scientists explore to explore, because there's lots of things that could be explored. Some of these things are going to turn into wonderful applications and some of these aren't, but we won't know unless we explore it. So,
I mean, Tiffany, to that point, the exploration piece, I mean, when you think about like the Explorers Club or people who hike Mount Everest or something like that, everybody's like, wow, they're so cool. Like, I would love to shift us away from like scientists to like cellular explorers or molecular paleontology or something like, you know, I think we just need a new brand.
Can you all say just a little bit more about goals versus tactics? There's some discussion about it in the chat, and just want to make sure we're clear on defining what we all mean when we say a goal versus a tactic.
I think a good one would be to I think John, we wish John was here because he.
I know.
Really,
that's John's work.
No, but I think that session early in the morning, he really tried to emphasize both in the chat as well, right? That tried to really get at what are these goals that we're trying to do? Is it trust in science? Are we trying to address misinformation, right? And there's a whole litany of them that are there. And that's from the scientist point of view. But then from the audience side, what are their goals? Is it hope that was communicated by Chris, right? Are they just seeking hope? And we know scientists actually do value hope as well. Right? So anyway, so I think the goals, from my understanding, the way I approach it, is try to understand like what are we actually trying to do. Tiffany, you said this. What are we trying to do, scientists? And then from the audience side, they're there because there's something that they're seeking, right? Trying to figure that out. That's it.
It's great. I want to go to this question by Shira. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Shira says, such great conversations here, thanks. I'm curious to hear thoughts about the who of communicating. Finding relevance for nature, funding stakeholders, science colleagues, general publics are all different audiences and possibly different skill sets to connect with them. These have different ways of communicating and connecting. Do you feel strongly that each scientist should be able to communicate in all the ways? I know we've touched on that a bit. Or is this perhaps a role for advocacy organizations and communicators to step in? And as I do, I'm going to add to this a little basic science addendum, because I hear this a lot from basic scientists. When I've talked with them about exploring what their relevance is, I've also heard some pushback of like, it's my job to do the science. It's someone else's job to explain why it's relevant and why it's important, whether it's my society or something else. So just kind of curious, like, whose responsibility is it to do these different things? And by unpacking relevance and utility, are we putting more responsibilities onto the scientists who already have a lot to do?
I mean, I personally feel like this is an opt-in opportunity, right? You cannot force, I mean, you could try to force scientists to care about other audiences, but if there isn't that willingness to engage, as Fanuel mentioned earlier, it's going to be very challenging to get anywhere. So I think most scientists are rewarded for their ability to communicate with other scientists. That is a recommended path for many scientists because that may be what makes them successful in their field. I think there are other scientists who see that they have a responsibility to convey information and learn about what other people feel in order to figure out what they want to explore. And I'm interested in that space. How do we take people who maybe have that predisposition and help them develop such that they can be more informed in their communication? I guess that would be my response to that. I don't think it's for everyone. I absolutely don't think that every person who publishes a paper in a top science journal is going to be the best messenger for every possible communication. I think that's really, so I think there is a role for advocacy organizations, but also for communicators like us and people who work with scientists in universities and lots of different groups who are trying to help facilitate some of that communication, either directly from scientists or in lieu of the scientists participating.
Yeah, we all have a role to play in this. I think it is a collective. Scientists have a role to play. Advocates have a role to play, right? There are diverse stakeholders in this space. I think maybe understanding that even will take us one step closer, right? So scientists don't feel like, oh, the burden is on me, right? This whole thing falls on me. It does not. There are a lot of allies that are out there. And I think understanding the challenges is that they don't know where they are, right? Jeannie, like you were talking about this, like you work with scientists, you tell them, actually, let me tell you, there's existing, organizational leaders that are already embedded in the communities. Let's tap into them and understand what your goals are, see what their goals are. Again, it takes time. This is the part that we need to really realize. It takes time, it takes infrastructure. So.
Yeah, and I love this point that was made by Stefan in the I think that, everybody's been sort of making this here around not every scientist will have to be good at or doing SciPOM. And I love the work by Adrienne Marie Brown around emergent strategy. And one of the core tenets of this is, find what people are good at and then elevate that thing, right? And so sometimes scientists who want to engage, maybe it's around like drawing art for something that someone else then presents, and Brooke, there was a question in the chat about how I might be able to engage with Orthodox Jewish communities as like a tattooed woman. And often I work with rabbis, and I'm not the one who necessarily is presenting the material. I might work with teachers and other members of that community to help them sort of become more familiar with it, like genetic. I mostly focus on genetics. And then they deliver it to the communities because they're the trusted people. I don't need to be, you don't need to be in the front of the room to make an impact around engagement. So I just also want to emphasize that point.
Yeah, it's a great point. Okay, I want to think a little bit about this idea that Fanuel started with around if we're being really clear about our goals, perhaps we'll better address some of the pitfalls we have with defaulting to utility. I am curious, as Tiffany and Jeannie, I know that you've done a lot to actively train scientists through various communication training programs. Fanuel, I know you're doing a lot to landscape and dig deep across many training programs. Have you seen or experienced this in terms of just practical tools for the hundreds of people here who are engaging, who spend time supporting scientists or doing through trainings or others? Goal setting is a really important part of what we do in trainings. Tools and resources that help think about goal setting and how utility fits in, and good examples for basic science. Do those exist? Do you have any you can share, and or is this something that we as a community should come up with a few additional ones for?
I think, so just in my work, articulated that way, not like that, but they're embedded deeply inside programs, right? And this is where, if we talk about evaluation, right, what works and what does not, we don't have really good data on that, right? There's a few publications here and there, but this is where, if I was to say more of that publication on training initiatives about what's working, what isn't, what are they labeling as what, right? Well, maybe it's this relevance thing, goal setting. Does it work now? Does it work 2 years from now, right? That's a very different question. And in the recent paper by Krista Longton, she was trying to evaluate their science communication program, the American Association for Anatomy. They got a grant to do this. And so they tried to do exactly that mapping, pre, post immediately, and then 2 years later, right? Looking at, okay, did they learn this thing? Is it still there? I can put the link to the pub later. But I think we need to start doing that. So some of these resources, to answer your question, Brooke, not in one place. It's in lots of places.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Jeannie, Tiffany, thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Fanuel. I think, the goal setting is it takes many conversations with scientists. It takes a lot. The one image that comes to my mind is a giant funnel. I always talk to our groups about this is start here, but then end here, right? And I opened my hands to be really large, and I closed my hands to be really small. A lot of people. Often I have people who want to communicate a certain element of their work, and they're like, I'm going to talk about the physics of how the hairs bend inside of your ear so that it creates a signal that delivers sound to your brain. So I'm like, that is amazing. Let's talk about that. But then they're like, first, I want to talk about the entire anatomy of the ear. And I have to like talk them off the ledge of, so this is against the goal of what you want to do, right? So it's always coming back, and it requires a lot of scaffolding. I don't know if there's any one specific tool that is something that I go to, but it's a lot of having conversations and a lot of, as Ed Yong said many, many years ago, killing your darlings.
Right.
Or I guess he didn't say that, but I learned of the phrase from him, because I'm pretty sure it was Oscar Wilde, but yeah.
All right. Thanks, Jeannie. Tiffany, anything you want to add?
No, I'm good.
Okay. We're in our final few minutes of this session. So I want to invite you all to just share high-level big take-home to leave us all with as we think about relevance of basic science and connection to basic science, whether or not it always has to be about utility. I feel like we've discussed really good reasons why it doesn't always have to be. And while you're thinking about that, also want to acknowledge to everyone here online that we do have Monica's talk up in the resource section already. So if you want to go back and watch that 10-minute talk so you can see her slides and not just hear the voiceover, that's available for you now. Okay, final thoughts. Tiffany, you want to get us started?
Yeah, so I would just say that I think this is a really interesting conversation. I actually think relevance is relevant for things more than basic science. I realize that's the focus of this content, but I think we really need to be thinking about how we're connecting with audiences, and we're setting like actual realistic ways to do that and specific audiences. I guess one thing I would be, we talk a lot about public, or when you go to, and I always like to give examples that are like, for this particular audience, what is going to work for them? What do we know based on what's been published that could work for this group that may be adjacent to that audience? So I think really thinking through how we're evaluating the trainings is important, but also like how we're evaluating the actual communication outcomes, and whether we're using that information to better inform what we do next, instead of it being a standalone, to kind of mirror what Fanuel was saying before. This may work for one particular thing. What is this going to work for the next thing? And really thinking about that and being reflective, and training scientists to be reflective so that they're learning something from the engagement as well, that it's not just a one-way street. Those are my take home.
Thanks, Tiffany. Jeannie?
Yeah, I would say that the biggest take home for me is that, how do I put this? Okay, so I think so one of the major outcomes that I would love for the people who participate in our programs is that they have a positive experience. Like, I'm not looking for them to like commit to being a scientist. I'm not looking for them to like vote a certain way. I think it's really important that scientists are just building relationships. And I think that one of the ways that we can move around this focus on utility is to focus more strongly on the relationships and earning trust in the community. And sometimes that means not really even talking about science so much, but sort of talking to people human to human. And so I think that's a really important first step, especially when we want to build that connection, and then go from there. And again, re-emphasizing all of the talk about time scale. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of reflection, messing up. Science communication is just like science research in my mind. It's like you develop a hypothesis, you develop a strategy and a protocol, you try it out, it fails in some area, and so you figure out where did it work and where did it not, and then you iterate, right? It's this consistent cycle of trying, iterating, reflecting, and trying again, right? And I think embracing that is really important. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you. Fanuel, you have the last word.
Oh my goodness. So one quickie piggyback from the other, one resource or one program, shall we say, that people can take a look at is actually Mónica had participated in this one. It's a SCOPE program, the Science Communication Online program at Northwestern University. One of the few places where they have their full evaluation publicly available. So you can take a look what they did and whether it worked or not, right? For those who are running training programs or experiences, doing more of that would be great, right? It doesn't have to be amazing where it's done by a third party, right? We know that costs money and all those things, but even the basics about what is it that you are trying to teach to those who are participating? What are they learning, right? What are they not learning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it is getting into this cycle. And Jeannie, you mentioned this, like us sharing this information so we can experiment more in this space. We can think creatively about scientists as part of the ecosystem and helping them connect to the existing stakeholders that are already here, right? So there's no reinvention of the wheel. So the question becomes, how do we do that? How do we sustain what they're doing, especially if it's working well, right? So there's so much to do. Goal setting as well. Who is doing that? Where and when is it working? We need to have more conversations. I think if I can put it like that, more conversations are needed. So this is good that we're doing this.
Great, thank you. I feel like one of my big take homes is where Fanuel started us today, which is maybe the utility concern would not be a concern if we were actually being strategic about our communications and setting our goals. That's really inspiring to think about. Okay, thank you to all of our panelists. Round of applause, yay. And to Mónica, we really appreciate her amazing talk and thoughts to get us going. Sorry she couldn't be with us today. She's doing some great science communication and leadership growth right now. And we are going to start our final session, which is just a quick wrap up of quick review of the day and what we have in store for us tomorrow. So we have to leave this session and then go back to the lobby, and you'll come back into the final session. We'll all be there in the next minute or so for an end of day wrap up. Thank you all so much.